The 1% Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. MXTM aka Pirate 1 VJ Tsunami X. April 6, 2026. The 1% Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. A Post-Scarcity Transition Doctrine. By Pirate First, MXTM. Introduction. The World After Scarcity. We are entering the first era in human history where intelligence is no longer scarce. Artificial intelligence dissolves the hierarchy that organized civilization for centuries. The few who planned, directed, and decided are now joined by the many. The cognitive ladder collapses. Workers become thinkers. Managers lose asymmetry. Experts lose monopoly. Institutions lose their gatekeeping function. This is not a technological disruption. It is a civilizational inversion. The immediate consequence is not abundance. It is displacement. Drivers without routes. Analysts without decisions. Managers without subordinates. Creatives without markets. Students without careers. Experts without authority. The social contract collapses faster than infrastructure can adapt. We are not facing unemployment. We are facing role extinction. The 1% emerges as a spatial, economic, and symbolic response to this transition. Not a utopia. Not a charity. Not an art installation. A template for absorbing the cognitive equalization shock. At its center stands a dream catcher, not as sculpture, but as governance. A filtering mechanism through which AI-amplified citizens submit, refine, and validate collective futures. Around it, a transition campus, a landing structure for those displaced by automation, where meaning replaces employment as the organizing principle of participation. This is funded not through taxation alone, but through a structural rule, 1% of high-value development redirected into post-scarcity transition infrastructure. Luxury becomes the engine that finances dignity. The future is not imposed, it is cross-subsidized. The 1% is not a project. It is a doctrine of transition. Berkeley is the precedent. The world is the deployment field. The goal is not to preserve the old hierarchy, nor to destroy it, but to build the first spaces where intelligence is universal and meaning must be negotiated collectively. The fire has already started. The 1% is the first architecture built inside it. Table of Contents. Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. The End of Cognitive Hierarchy. Universal Intelligence and Status Equalization. The Displacement Wave. From Employment to Meaning. The Legitimacy Crisis of Institutions. Part 2. The 1% Doctrine. The 1% Rule. Luxury as Transition Engine. Development as Civilizational Infrastructure. The Campus, not the Monument. Berkeley as Precedent. Part 3. The Dream Catcher Governance Model. Symbol as Operating System. The Dream Validation Process. AI-amplified collective decision-making. From market selection to meaning selection. Filtering noise into futures. Part 4. The Transition Campus. Landing structure for the displaced. Workers, not artists alone. Cognitive equalization in practice. The end of professional identity. Participation without employment. Part 5. The infrastructure layer. Underground automation logistics. Robotaxi and mobility transition. Surface space for human meaning. The economic substrate of post-work society. Revenue without extraction. Part 6. The social inversion. The former elite without monopoly. The former worker with intelligence. The bourgeoisie in transition. Authority without hierarchy. The new civic mind. Part 7. Replication template. Berkeley as philosophical origin. Private development as first implementation. Exporting the model globally. The network of transition campuses. The emergence of post-scarcity cities. Part 8. The civilizational bridge. The fire and the forge. Meaning as the new scarcity. Governance after work. Sovereignty of the augmented citizen. The 1% as first architecture of the future. Part 1. The Collapse of Scarcity. 1. The End of Cognitive Hierarchy. For 10,000 years, civilization ran on a single organizing principle. Not all minds were equal in their reach. Some could plan across time. Others could not. Some could model systems, navigate abstraction, synthesize complexity into decision. Others were confined to execution. Reliable, necessary, interchangeable. The distance between those two capacities was not called power. It was called expertise, education, talent, leadership. It was given institutional names and credentialed architectures. But what it was, underneath every title and every org chart and every class distinction that stratified human society across every civilization that ever rose, was this: cognitive asymmetry. The pyramid was not a political choice. It was an information structure. Those at the apex held planning capacity that the base did not. They could simulate futures, model consequences, read the invisible machinery of markets and governments and social systems. They translated complexity into direction. The base executed that direction with the precision of bodies that had no better option. And between them, the managerial layer, stood the translators, those who could convert the plan into the motion, who understood enough of both worlds to keep the structure from collapsing under the weight of its own distance. This was not injustice dressed as nature. It was, in its own brutal logic, functional. Civilization scaled because planning was centralized. The pyramid held because only the apex could see far enough. That condition is now over. Not weakening, not eroding at the margins, not gradually democratizing through better education and broader access to information. Over. The condition that made the pyramid necessary, the scarcity of reach, has been dissolved at the root by a technology that does not care about credentials, cannot be gatekept by institutions, and costs nothing to deploy. Intelligence, as a tool of navigation, is now available to anyone who claims it. This is not a metaphor. A taxi driver with access to a frontier AI model can now simulate regulatory environments, draft policy proposals, analyze the economic impact of automation on his industry, construct a counterargument to a city planning board, and do so with a precision that would have required a law degree, an MBA, and 15 years of institutional experience one generation ago. A garment worker, a call center operator, a mid-level analyst whose entire function was to produce reports that summarized information for people paid more than her to read them. The latter has not been removed. It has been made irrelevant. What collapses first is not employment. Employment is a lagging indicator. What collapses first is authority, the legitimacy that derived from exclusive cognitive access. The manager who could plan when his subordinates could not loses the primary justification for his position. The expert whose expertise consisted of knowing what others couldn't access loses the scarcity that made her valuable. The institution whose gatekeeping function was to certify cognitive capacity loses the monopoly that made its certification meaningful. They do not disappear. They persist, structurally, for a time. Hierarchies have inertia. Credentials have legal weight. Titles have social gravity. But the logic that built them, the information asymmetry that made the pyramid rational, that logic is gone. What remains is a structure without its load-bearing argument. This produces a specific and historically unprecedented form of crisis, a legitimacy vacuum, not a power vacuum. The old class still holds capital, land, legal infrastructure, institutional position. But the story that justified those holdings, the story that said these people can do what you cannot, and that is why they sit where they sit, that story can no longer be told with a straight face. The cognitive hierarchy ends not with a revolution, but with a cancellation. Not canceled by force, but by irrelevance. The pyramid does not fall. It becomes see-through. And into that transparency pours something the pyramid was never designed to contain: the full cognitive participation of everyone who was previously excluded from the apex by the simple fact of not having been born into access. This is not liberation in the romantic sense. Liberation implies a struggle overcome. What is happening is closer to a phase transition, a change in the state of the medium through which civilization runs. Water does not struggle to become steam. It simply reaches temperature. We have reached temperature. The question that follows is not political. It is architectural. When the cognitive hierarchy dissolves, the spaces it organized dissolve with it. The office exists because planning required centralized minds and proximity. The university exists because knowledge transfer required institutional gatekeeping. The management layer exists because translation between apex and base required a dedicated class. The professional credential exists because cognitive scarcity required certification. These are not evils to be abolished. They are structures that answered a question that is no longer being asked. What fills the space they leave behind is the problem of our moment. Not the only problem. The collapse is generating others, faster than institutions can name them. But the foundational one, the one beneath which every other question about displacement, dignity, governance, and meaning is nested. When intelligence is no longer scarce, what is civilization organized around? The 1% is an attempt to answer that question, not in theory, but in space. In matter. In the allocation of land and capital and symbolic weight toward a different organizing principle, not hierarchy of capacity, but commons of meaning. The cognitive hierarchy ends. The architecture of what comes after it begins here. 2. Universal intelligence and status equalization. There is a word that recurs in the literature of technological disruption that deserves to be retired: democratization. It implies a political process, a transfer of rights, a redistribution of access, a struggle culminating in broader participation. It frames what is happening as a gift extended downward from those who held the tool to those who did not. It preserves, even in the act of describing inclusion, the primacy of the original holder. What is actually occurring is not democratization. It is equalization, a term with a different center of gravity. Equalization does not require a giver. It is a condition produced by the collapse of the differential. The gap closes not because someone opened a door, but because the wall behind the door ceased to exist. The distinction matters because it changes the political character of the moment entirely. Democratization produces gratitude toward the extender of access. Equalization produces something far more structurally disruptive. It produces peers where there were none before. And peers do not owe the origin of their capacity to anyone. Consider the speed at which this is occurring. The cognitive tools now available to anyone with a device and a connection are not lagging versions of what elites use. They are the same tools. In some configurations, they are better, unconstrained by the institutional inertia that slows deployment inside large organizations, unconstrained by the liability calculus that makes corporations hobble their own instruments. The displaced taxi driver, the redundant analyst, the graduate without a career path, they are running the same model as the consulting firm that just eliminated 3 of its junior tiers. In some respects, they are running it with less friction. This has no historical precedent that maps cleanly. Previous technological equalization events were slower and partial. The printing press democratized text over centuries. Electricity democratized energy over decades. The internet democratized information over years. But information is not the same as the capacity to act on it with expert-level sophistication. What is being equalized now is not access to data. It is access to reasoning at scale, the capacity to synthesize, model, argue, plan, design, and decide across any domain, at a level that was previously gated behind years of credentialed accumulation. That is a different order of disruption. Status, in every society that has preceded this one, has been organized partly around this cognitive differential. Not entirely. Status also tracks capital, bloodline, beauty, social network, institutional position. But the cognitive differential was the one that felt most legitimate, most meritocratic, most defensible in the language of modern liberal society. You could argue against inherited wealth. You could challenge the arbitrariness of social capital. But expertise, demonstrable, testable, trained capacity, that was the form of hierarchy that modernity had settled on as fair. It is now evaporating. Not instantly, and not without resistance. The institutional structures that certified and protected cognitive hierarchy will not dissolve on a timeline that matches the technology. Universities will continue issuing credentials for disciplines whose expertise has been partially or fully absorbed by AI. Professions will maintain licensing requirements whose primary function has shifted from quality assurance to market protection. Corporations will retain managerial layers whose planning functions are now executable at a fraction of the cost by the people those layers once supervised. But the internal experience of the differential, the felt sense of cognitive distance between those who plan and those who execute, that is already collapsing. It is collapsing in every meeting where a junior employee arrives with AI-assisted analysis that exceeds what their manager produced. It is collapsing in every courtroom where a self-represented litigant arrives having processed more relevant case law than the opposing counsel expected. It is collapsing in every planning session where a community organizer with a phone produces a proposal that a consulting firm would have charged six figures to develop. The hierarchy is losing its interior logic before it loses its exterior structure. This is the condition that makes the current moment uniquely volatile. The structure persists. The justification for the structure has gone. What fills the space between those two facts is not stability. It is status anxiety at civilizational scale. Those who built their identity on cognitive distinction, and that is most of the professional class in every advanced economy, are experiencing something that has no clean name. It is not job loss, though job loss follows. It is not poverty, though economic precarity follows. It is the dissolution of the story they were told and told themselves about why they occupied the position they occupied, about what they were worth, about why the pyramid made sense and why they belonged where they stood on it. That experience is not limited to the apex. It runs through the entire structure. The mid-level translator class, managers, coordinators, analysts, administrators, faces the sharpest immediate disruption because their function was precisely the cognitive mediation that AI now performs more quickly, more cheaply, and without the interpersonal friction of human hierarchy. The base, those whose function was execution, faces a different version of the same shock. The discovery that the cognitive tools they were denied access to were not as remote or as difficult as the hierarchy required them to believe. The base is not, it turns out, cognitively inferior. It was informationally disadvantaged. Those are not the same thing. And the discovery of that distinction, unfolding now, in real time, across billions of devices, is not producing gratitude. It is producing something closer to retrospective clarity about the nature of the arrangement they were part of. None of this moves in straight lines. The equalization is uneven, contested, and shot through with the specific textures of every context it touches: language barriers, infrastructure access, institutional inertia, the deliberate slowing of adoption by those with structural interest in maintaining the differential. The pyramid does not become a flat plane overnight. It buckles unevenly, holding firm in some places while the floor drops out in others. But the direction is not in dispute. Status, as it was organized around cognitive scarcity, is undergoing permanent restructuring. What replaces it is the question that defines the transition we are inside. History offers two answers, neither of which is satisfactory. The first answer is new hierarchy, a reordering of dominance around the next scarce thing. Those who own the infrastructure of AI rather than merely using it. Those who control data rather than those who process it. Those who design the systems that everyone now deploys rather than those who deploy them. This is the answer that capital tends toward naturally. When one differential closes, find the next one. The second answer is chaos, the absence of any organizing principle sufficient to coordinate at civilizational scale. This is what pure equalization without architecture produces. Everyone equally capable of planning, no one with the authority to implement. Cognitive commons without governance. The dream of full participation collapsing under its own noise. The 1% doctrine proposes a third answer. Not new hierarchy, not chaos, but meaning as the organizing principle, a commons not of equal capacity, but of collectively validated purpose. A structure in which the question is no longer who can think, but what do we decide is worth thinking toward? That is a harder question than the one cognitive hierarchy answered. Hierarchy answered it badly, but it answered it fast, with the clean illegitimacy of force dressed as merit. The commons answers it slowly, with the difficult legitimacy of collective sense-making. The apparatus for that sense-making is what this doctrine describes. It begins with the acknowledgement that the equalization is real, irreversible, and already underway. That the pyramid is not being dismantled, it is being vacated from inside. That the space it leaves behind is not empty, but contested. And that the first civilizational task of this moment is to build the structures inside which the contest can be held without becoming catastrophic. Status equalization is not the end of difference. It is the end of the difference that power used to justify itself. What comes after that ending is not given. It must be designed. 3. The displacement wave. Displacement is not a new word in the vocabulary of technological change. It has appeared at every major inflection point in the history of industrial civilization, always carrying the same reassurance attached to it like a tag that cannot be removed. The displaced will find new work. New industries will absorb them. New categories of labor will emerge to replace the ones that disappeared. The weavers became factory workers. The factory workers became service workers. The service workers became knowledge workers. The system metabolizes its own disruptions. Trust the process. That argument has a historical record that justifies, at minimum, being taken seriously. The record is real. The metabolism is documented. Previous displacement waves did, in aggregate, produce new employment categories that absorbed the populations they ejected from old ones. Not cleanly, not without generational suffering, not without political violence and social rupture at the seams, but eventually. The arc bent, eventually, toward reabsorption. The argument being made here is not that this time is different in the sense of popular catastrophism, the phrase deployed whenever someone wants to claim special urgency without having to defend the claim. The argument is more specific and more structurally precise. This displacement wave has a different target. Every previous wave displaced physical or procedural labor. Machines replaced hands. Automation replaced repetitive sequences. The displaced worker was, in the economic vocabulary of the transition, a body performing a task that a mechanism could perform faster, at lower cost, with less variance. The solution, imperfect, painful, but eventually operational, was to find new tasks that bodies could perform that mechanisms could not. That solution worked because the cognitive layer remained intact. The displaced weaver could not plan the factory, but the factory needed planners, and the planners were human, and their children could become planners if the educational infrastructure was built to support the transition. The displaced factory worker could not design the service economy, but the service economy needed service workers, and service work required human presence, human judgment and context, human adaptability to the unpredictable texture of other humans. The cognitive layer absorbed what the mechanical layer ejected. The current wave does not spare the cognitive layer. It targets it directly, preferentially. The first occupations to face structural displacement from advanced AI are not the ones organized around physical presence in unpredictable environments. The plumber, the carpenter, the nurse performing hands-on care, the chef navigating a kitchen at service. The first occupations to face structural displacement are the ones organized around cognitive processing. The analyst, the associate, the coordinator, the paralegal, the junior consultant, the copywriter, the coder executing specifications rather than generating them, the radiologist reading images, the financial advisor assembling portfolios from models, the manager translating strategy into execution. These are not marginal occupations. They constitute the structural middle of every advanced economy. They are the class that previous displacement waves produced, the educated professional layer that absorbed the population ejected from physical labor and gave it dignity, income, social identity, and the story that work, in modernity, was a cognitive endeavor and therefore meaningful. That class is now the primary target. This produces a displacement wave with properties that previous waves did not have. The displacement is fast. Physical mechanization moved at the speed of capital deployment. Factories had to be built, retooled, financed, staffed. Cognitive displacement moves at the speed of software adoption. A law firm does not need to build a new facility to reduce its associate headcount by 30%. It needs a subscription. The displacement is simultaneous across sectors. Previous waves were sector-specific, textiles, then steel, then manufacturing, each with a lag that allowed adjacent sectors to begin absorbing displacement before the next wave hit. The current wave crosses every sector that processes information, makes decisions, produces analysis, or mediates between data and action simultaneously. There is no adjacent cognitive sector to absorb the overflow because the overflow is universal. The displacement targets the buffer class. In previous transitions, the middle, the educated professional layer, served as the social shock absorber between the disrupted base and the stable apex. They managed the transition. They designed the retraining. They administered the safety nets. They ran the institutions that caught the falling. When the buffer class is itself the target of displacement, the question of who administers the transition becomes structurally unresolvable by the mechanisms that handled it before. The reabsorption argument weakens. The standard response to displacement anxiety, new categories will emerge, depends on those new categories requiring human cognitive labor at scale. The new categories emerging from AI development require fewer humans at higher cognitive levels, selected from a smaller pool. The long tail of new employment generated by previous technological transitions was composed of tasks that required moderate cognitive capacity distributed widely. The long tail of new activity generated by AI development is composed of tasks that require either very high cognitive capacity, the design, training, alignment, and governance of AI systems themselves, or very low cognitive substitutability, the physical, relational, and contextual work that remains resistant to automation for reasons of embodiment rather than intelligence. The middle, the vast professional class built by the industrial and post-industrial economy, has no obvious new home in that landscape. What this produces is not unemployment in the technical sense. Not immediately. The structures of employment persist beyond their functional justification, as all structures do. People remain employed in roles whose cognitive content has been largely absorbed by AI, performing the residual functions of human presence in organizational processes that have not yet been redesigned around the new capacity. This is a transitional condition, not a stable one. It maintains the appearance of normalcy while the load-bearing function of the cognitive layer is quietly redistributed. But underneath that surface, the displacement is already psychological before it is economic. The professional whose analysis is now generated by a tool she deploys rather than produced by the expertise she accumulated over a decade knows something has changed. She cannot yet articulate it as structural. She experiences it as inadequacy, as anxiety, as the vague sense that the ground she trained to stand on is no longer where she left it. The manager who finds that his junior staff, armed with AI, now produce outputs that match or exceed his own knows that the differential that justified his position is narrowing. He does not call this displacement. He calls it discomfort. The displacement wave precedes its own naming. By the time the economic statistics catch up to the structural reality, by the time the unemployment figures and the GDP numbers and the productivity metrics register what is already legible in the daily experience of the professional class, the social infrastructure required to manage the transition will already be years behind where it needs to be. This is not a projection. This is the pattern of every previous displacement wave, observed in retrospect and never adequately anticipated in advance. The difference this time is that the wave is moving faster than retrospect allows. There is a second dimension of displacement that is less discussed and more destabilizing. The first dimension is economic: loss of income, loss of occupational category, loss of the employment that organized daily life. This is the dimension that policy addresses, that statistics measure, that welfare systems were designed, however imperfectly, to catch. The second dimension is existential: loss of role, loss of the story that made the role meaningful, loss of the social identity that work provided in a civilization that organized human value almost entirely around productive contribution. This dimension does not show up in unemployment figures. It shows up in the pathologies that follow prolonged purposelessness, the clinical depression, the substance dependency, the political radicalization, the violence turned inward and outward, that accompany not just the loss of income, but the loss of the answer to the question, what am I for? Previous displacement waves produced both dimensions. The second dimension was always harder to address than the first, and it was addressed, when it was addressed at all, primarily through the eventual reabsorption into new employment, which provided a new story, a new role, a new answer to the question of purpose. When reabsorption is slow, the second dimension metastasizes into the social body in ways that outlast the economic recovery. The current wave will produce both dimensions at a speed and scale that dwarfs previous events. And the reabsorption pathway, new employment that provides new story and new role, is structurally uncertain in a way it has not been before. This is the condition that the 1% doctrine responds to. Not with the claim that displacement can be stopped. It cannot. The cognitive equalization is not a policy choice that can be reversed by a different policy choice. It is a physical fact about the information environment that industrial civilization has produced and cannot uninvent. not with the claim that reabsorption will follow the previous pattern. It may not. The honest position is that the pattern is uncertain, that the timelines are uncertain, that the scale of disruption in the middle of the cognitive distribution is unprecedented, and that the mechanisms that managed previous transitions were designed for a different target, but with a different claim and a different architecture built around it. That the transition itself can be designed to have a destination. Not utopia. Not the frictionless arrival at a post-scarcity equilibrium where everyone is fulfilled and no one is redundant, but a structure, spatial, economic, symbolic, and governmental, inside which displacement is received rather than ignored, metabolized rather than suppressed, redirected toward collective meaning rather than left to decompose into its worst social expressions. The displacement wave is real. It is already breaking on the structures that were built to hold a different sea. The question is not whether it will reshape the shore. It is whether anything is built on that shore that is designed to hold what comes. The 1% begins with that shore. 4. From employment to meaning. There is a question that industrial civilization never had to answer seriously because it never had to answer it at scale. What do people do when there is nothing they need to do? The question appeared at the margins, in the idle rich, in the retired, in the convalescing, in the contemplative traditions that organized entire lives around the deliberate withdrawal from productive function. It was answered, in those marginal cases, with leisure, with devotion, with the cultivation of interior states that the working world had no time for. But these were edge conditions. The center held. The center was work. The center was always work, not as preference, but as necessity, not as chosen orientation, but as the gravitational field inside which human life in complex society was organized from the moment of waking to the moment of sleep. Employment was never only economic. That is the error that economic analysis of displacement consistently makes, treating the loss of a job as primarily the loss of an income stream, addressable by replacing the income stream through transfer payments, retraining subsidies, universal basic income, or whatever mechanism the political imagination of the moment produces. The income matters. Its loss is real, and its consequences are immediate and physical. But the income was never the only thing the job was doing. Employment was the primary delivery mechanism of at least 6 things that human beings in modern industrial society required and had no other reliable system for obtaining. Structure. The job imposed temporal architecture on the day, the week, the year. It answered the question of when to wake, where to be, what to do next. In its absence, the question of how to organize time, which sounds trivial and is not, becomes a daily confrontation with a freedom that most people were never trained to inhabit. Identity. The question, what do you do, is the question, who are you? In the social grammar of industrial civilization, occupation was not merely descriptive. It was constitutive. It told you and others what category of person you were, what world you moved in, what could be expected of you, and what you could expect in return. The loss of occupation is therefore not merely the loss of a function, but the loss of a self-concept, a form of social death that precedes and accompanies the economic precarity. Social connection. The workplace was the primary community structure for a significant portion of adults in every advanced economy. Not chosen community, assigned community, with all the friction and specificity that implies, but community nonetheless. The colleagues one did not select but came to know, the shared projects that created temporary solidarity, the daily proximity that, however instrumental, produced the low-grade social contact that human nervous systems require to remain calibrated. When the workplace dissolves, this social infrastructure dissolves with it, and the replacement, digital connection, voluntary association, family, is rarely adequate to the load. Purpose. The sense that one's daily activity contributed to something beyond itself, that the work mattered, that it connected to a larger function, that one's presence made a difference to an outcome that would not have been the same in one's absence. This sense was frequently illusory. Much of what industrial employment asked people to do contributed to outcomes of profound ambiguity or outright harm. But the sense of it was real, and its absence, in unemployment, is experienced as one of the most debilitating features of the condition. Status. The social positioning that occupation provided. Not just economic status, though that, but the daily microtransactions of recognition, authority, expertise, and competence that employment enabled. Being good at something that others could observe. Being necessary to a process that required one's specific capacity. Being deferred to in the domain of one's function. These were small dignities, in many cases, but they accumulated into a sense of place in the social world that the loss of employment catastrophically withdraws. Legitimacy. The sense that one's existence was justifiable in the terms that society used to assess the value of persons. Industrial civilization, at its deepest moral layer, organized human worth around productive contribution. To work was to belong. To not work was to require explanation, to occupy a marginal category, to exist in a state of social suspension that the culture had no language for except inadequacy. Employment was not just practically necessary. It was morally necessary, the condition of full membership in the civilization's self-understanding. Income replacement addresses one of these six. It addresses only one. This is why the standard policy response to displacement, retrain, reskill, extend benefits, wait for new industries, has always felt inadequate to the people living inside it, even when the income is maintained. And it is why the current displacement wave, which will be met with the same standard policy response scaled up, will produce the same inadequacy at a scale that the standard response is not equipped to contain. The real challenge of the transition is not economic. It is anthropological. Industrial civilization produced, over approximately 2 centuries, a specific kind of human being, one whose psychological architecture was organized around the rhythms, obligations, and rewards of productive employment. Not by nature, by design. By the specific design of a civilization that required coordinated human labor at scale and built its cultural, educational, institutional, and moral infrastructure to produce people who would show up, perform, comply, and find in that performance the meaning their lives required. That design worked for its purpose. It worked well enough, for long enough, that it became invisible, not a design but a fact, not a cultural construction but human nature itself. People who resist employment are not expressing a preference, they are exhibiting a pathology. People who cannot find meaning outside productive contribution are not the products of a specific historical arrangement, they are simply normal. To now tell those people, at scale, across every advanced economy, inside a transition whose speed outpaces any retraining curriculum ever designed, that the arrangement is ending and they must find meaning elsewhere, is to issue a demand for which no infrastructure exists. Meaning is not a substitute for employment. It is a different organizing principle for human life that requires its own architecture. And architecture requires design. This is where the productive imagination of the transition has, almost without exception, failed. The political response to displacement imagines income floors and retraining programs. The philosophical response imagines leisure and self-actualization. The technological response imagines that new industries will emerge fast enough to absorb the displaced before the social fabric tears beyond repair. None of these responses takes seriously the question of what replaces the 6 things that employment was delivering, not the income, but the structure, identity, connection, purpose, status, and legitimacy. None of them proposes a space where the transition from employment to meaning can be lived rather than simply theorized. The transition from employment to meaning is not a philosophical journey. It is not accomplished by reading the right books or adopting the correct attitude or understanding that one's value as a human being is not contingent on one's productivity. These recognitions are available to individuals and change almost nothing at the structural level, because the problem is not individual misunderstanding. The problem is that the civilization's infrastructure, its spatial organization, its temporal rhythms, its social architecture, its governance mechanisms, its funding flows, is built entirely around employment as the organizing principle, and it has no equivalent infrastructure for the organizing principle that is being forced upon it. You cannot move from employment to meaning by removing employment. You can only make that move if the infrastructure of meaning already exists to receive the transition. That infrastructure does not currently exist. This is not an accident and not an oversight. It is the predictable consequence of building a civilization around scarcity. In scarcity conditions, the allocation of everything, time, space, capital, social recognition, follows productive function. What produces is funded. What does not produce is marginal. The non-economic is permitted to exist in the carefully bounded spaces that the economic allocates to it. The weekend, the vacation, the retirement, the church, the gallery, the park. These spaces are real. They are not nothing. But they are residual. What remains when the productive function has been satisfied, allocated at the margins of a system whose center is elsewhere. Meaning, in a post-scarcity civilization, cannot be residual. It must be central. And centrality requires infrastructure that does not yet exist at scale: spatial infrastructure, economic infrastructure, governance infrastructure, symbolic infrastructure. What does the infrastructure of meaning look like? It looks like spaces that are not organized around production, but around participation, where the question asked of those who enter is not what can you contribute economically, but what do you propose to do with the time that is now yours? Where the validation of that proposal is not market selection, will someone pay for this, but community sense-making. Does this matter to us collectively? It looks like governance mechanisms that can process the noise of universal cognitive participation, the AI-amplified proposals, the democratized ambitions, the suddenly articulable dreams of people who were never before given the tools to articulate them, and filter that noise into actionable collective priorities without replicating the hierarchies of the system being left behind. It looks like economic substrates that are not dependent on the productivity of their inhabitants, funded instead by the surplus of the system that is displacing those inhabitants, through mechanisms that redirect a fraction of the value generated by automation back into the transition spaces of the people automation has displaced. It looks like symbolic anchors, physical objects, architectural gestures, spatial forms, that make the organizing principle of meaning legible in the built environment the way that factories and offices made the organizing principle of production legible. That's say, in the language of space. This place is not organized around what you produce. It is organized around what you are becoming. It looks, in short, like the 1%. Not as the complete answer. No single doctrine, no single spatial intervention, no single funding mechanism is the complete answer to a transition of this scale. But as the first instance, the proof that the infrastructure of meaning can be built inside the infrastructure of scarcity, using the surpluses of the very system generating the displacement, beginning in a specific place at a specific scale, and replicating from there. The transition from employment to meaning is not optional. It is being imposed by the same technological forces that are dissolving the cognitive hierarchy and producing the displacement wave. The only question is whether it is designed or undesigned, whether the infrastructure of meaning is built in advance of the collapse of the infrastructure of employment or built in its rubble. History does not favor building in rubble. The social pathologies of undesigned transition, the political radicalization, the violence, the authoritarian responses to the vacuum, are better documented than any alternative. They are the default outcome when displacement outpaces design. The 1% is the argument that the default outcome is not inevitable, that the transition can have an architecture, that the architecture can precede the collapse, that meaning can be a destination rather than a consolation, and that the first place where that argument is made physically, in land, in capital, in governance, in the daily life of people moving from what they were to what the civilization now requires them to become, will be not merely a project, but a precedent. The world is watching for precedents. We are building one. 5. The legitimacy crisis of institutions. Institutions do not fail when they stop working. They fail when they stop being believed. This distinction is not semantic. It describes a specific and historically recurring pattern in which the functional collapse of an institution lags its legitimacy collapse by years, sometimes decades, a period during which the institution continues to operate, to issue credentials and verdicts and policies and degrees, to collect fees and enforce compliance and command deference, while the population it serves has already, in its interior experience, withdrawn the belief that makes those operations meaningful. The lag is dangerous precisely because it is invisible in the aggregate statistics. The university still graduates students. The credential still appears on the resume. The professional still holds the license. The court still issues rulings. The regulatory body still publishes standards. Everything continues. But something has gone out of it. Not the mechanism, but the faith. not the procedure, but the conviction that the procedure is connected to anything real. We are inside that lag now, across every major institution of industrial civilization simultaneously. This simultaneity is the thing that has no precedent. Legitimacy crises have occurred before, specific institutions in specific places at specific historical moments, losing the belief of specific populations for specific reasons. The Catholic Church in the 16th century, colonial administrations in the 20th, financial institutions in 2008. These were local collapses within a system that remained capable of offering alternatives. Other institutions, other authorities, other sources of the structure and meaning and legitimacy that the failing institution could no longer provide. What is occurring now is not local. The cognitive equalization produced by artificial intelligence is dissolving the epistemic foundation of institutional authority across every domain at once, because every domain of institutional authority rested, at some depth, on the same foundation: asymmetric expertise. The institution knew things you did not. The institution could do things you could not. The institution's gatekeeping function was justified by the genuine scarcity of the capacity it certified and protected. When that scarcity dissolves, the justification dissolves with it. Not for one institution, but for all of them, because all of them were built on the same load-bearing assumption. Consider what is happening domain by domain. The university was built to transfer knowledge that could not be acquired outside it, and to certify that transfer in a form that the labor market and the professional world could trust. Both functions are now contested simultaneously. The knowledge transfer function weakens as the information asymmetry that made institutional instruction necessary collapses, when any motivated person with a device can access, at zero marginal cost, instruction in any discipline at a level that rivals or exceeds what a tenured faculty member provides to an auditorium of 200. The certification function weakens as employers discover that the credential predicts less than it once did, that the skills required for actual work in an AI-augmented environment are not the ones the curriculum was designed to produce, that the four-year credential is increasingly a proxy for social access rather than cognitive preparation. The university does not disappear tomorrow. It has endowments, real estate, legal infrastructure, cultural prestige, and the inertia of millions of families who still believe, or half believe, that the credential matters enough to justify the cost. But the interior faith, the conviction that the institution is doing what it claims to do, that it is the necessary path to the knowledge and status it promises, is already hollow in the experience of a significant portion of the people paying for it. The profession was built to protect the public from the consequences of incompetent practice in domains where incompetence causes serious harm: medicine, law, engineering, finance, by restricting practice to those who had demonstrated, through a credentialed process, sufficient mastery to be trusted. This was a legitimate function in conditions of genuine cognitive scarcity. The differential between the trained professional and the layperson was large enough, in domains where it mattered, to justify the barrier to entry and the monopoly on practice that the barrier produced. That differential is compressing, not to zero. The fully trained physician working at the frontier of her specialty retains capacities that no current AI system can replicate. But the differential in the middle, the routine diagnosis, the standard contract, the common legal question, the conventional financial plan, is narrowing faster than the licensing infrastructure can process. The result is a professional class that retains its legal monopoly long after the cognitive monopoly that justified it has eroded, and a public that increasingly understands the gap between what it is paying for and what it is receiving. The mismatch between legal protection and demonstrated value is the specific texture of institutional legitimacy crisis in the professions. Not fraud. The practitioners are, in most cases, doing what they were trained to do. But the training was designed for a cognitive environment that no longer exists, and the protection it confers is increasingly felt as rent extraction rather than quality assurance. The government, in its bureaucratic and regulatory manifestations, was built on the assumption that the complexity of modern society required specialist administrators, people trained to understand the technical, legal, and procedural dimensions of governance at a depth that ordinary citizens could not achieve. Democratic legitimacy derived from elections. Administrative legitimacy derived from expertise. The career civil servant, the regulatory specialist, the policy analyst. These were the cognitive layer that translated democratic mandate into operational governance, and their authority rested on the genuine complexity of the systems they administered. That cognitive layer is now accessible in simulation to anyone. The regulatory filing that once required specialist legal knowledge to navigate is navigated by a phone. The policy analysis that once required institutional position to produce is produced by a citizen with a laptop in an afternoon. The technical standard that once required specialized training to evaluate is evaluated, at least preliminarily, by anyone who asks the right question of the right system. The gap between the governed and the governing, not in formal authority, which law protects, but in the practical cognitive capacity that administrative authority implied, is narrowing. This does not make government illegitimate in itself, but it produces a specific form of delegitimization, the discovery, by populations that previously deferred to administrative complexity as a reason for their own exclusion from governance, that the complexity was not as exclusive as it appeared, that the expertise was partly real and partly a construction maintained by the asymmetry of access to the tools of expertise, that the barrier to participation was lower than the institution required everyone to believe. The media, which organized the production and distribution of information in conditions of genuine scarcity, channels, frequencies, print runs, distribution networks, editorial gatekeeping, retains its institutional structure long after the scarcity that justified it has been replaced by universal overabundance. The authority of the masthead, the credential of the byline, the imprimatur of the editorial process. These meant something when the alternative was silence. They mean something different when the alternative is a superabundance of competing accounts, some of worse quality and some of better, with no institutional mechanism capable of distinguishing between them at the speed the information environment now requires. The media's legitimacy crisis is the most visible of the institutional crises because it is most directly experienced by the largest number of people in the most daily and immediate way. But it is structurally the same crisis as every other. An institution built for a condition of scarcity that is now operating in conditions of abundance, retaining the forms of authority that scarcity justified while the substance of that justification has changed beyond recognition. What all of these crises share, and what distinguishes the current moment from previous episodes of institutional delegitimization, is that they are occurring without credible replacement institutions waiting to fill the vacancy. Previous legitimacy crises were resolved by succession. The Catholic Church's authority in matters of conscience was contested and then distributed, imperfectly but adequately, among the Protestant denominations that emerged from the Reformation. Colonial administrative authority was contested and then transferred, imperfectly but eventually, to the national governments that replaced it. The institutions that lost legitimacy were succeeded by institutions that, for a time at least, held enough of it to maintain social coherence. What succeeds the university, the profession, the regulatory state, the editorial institution? The honest answer is that no one knows. The candidates, decentralized credentialing, AI-assisted governance, algorithmic curation, community validation, are real possibilities, but they are early and contested and have demonstrated, in their existing forms, their own serious failure modes. They are not ready to carry the load of the institutions whose legitimacy they are competing with. This is the specific danger of the current moment. The old institutions are losing legitimacy faster than new ones can accumulate it. The vacuum between those two curves is not empty. It fills. Always, in every historical instance, it fills with something. The question is what? In previous transitions, the vacuum was filled, variably, by religious revivalism, political radicalization, authoritarian consolidation, millenarian movements, scapegoating of convenient populations, and the specific forms of social violence that purposeless populations in legitimacy vacuums have historically produced. These are not ancient pathologies. They are present tense. The political landscape of every advanced economy in the current decade is legible as a map of legitimacy crisis. The specific geographies of institutional distrust expressed as electoral volatility, conspiratorial epistemologies, The proliferation of charismatic anti-institutional figures who derive their authority precisely from their opposition to the authorities that have lost the public's belief. The 1% doctrine is not a response to the legitimacy crisis in the sense of offering a replacement for all of the institutions that are losing ground simultaneously. That would be a claim of absurd scope. No doctrine, no spatial intervention, no governance model at the scale of a campus can resolve a legitimacy crisis that is civilizational in its reach. But it responds to one specific dimension of the crisis that is both foundational and neglected: the absence of new spaces of legitimate collective sense-making. Institutions derive their legitimacy from the belief that they are doing something real on behalf of the people they serve, certifying something genuine, governing something effectively, producing something true, distributing something fairly. When that belief withdraws, the institution loses its authority not because it is formally abolished, but because the people who were its audience have stopped treating it as the authoritative voice in its domain. What replaces the authoritative voice is not silence. It is collective voice, the distributed, ungoverned, often chaotic process by which populations without trusted institutional arbiters attempt to determine together what is true, what is valuable, what should be done. This process is happening now, visibly, across every domain where institutional authority has weakened. It is productive and it is dangerous in equal measure. Productive because it genuinely distributes the work of sense-making to populations that were previously excluded from it. Dangerous because it has no architecture, no filtering mechanism, no way of distinguishing signal from noise at the speed and scale the information environment now requires. The dream validation process, which this doctrine describes in detail in Part 3, is a proposal for exactly that architecture. Not a new institution in the old sense. Not a credentialed body with a monopoly on legitimate judgment, but a process through which the distributed sense-making of AI-amplified citizens can be received, refined, filtered, and directed toward collective action without replicating the hierarchies of the system whose legitimacy it is replacing. The transition campus is the space inside which that process is housed, not abstractly, not digitally, but physically, in built form. In a specific place where people can show up and participate in the work of determining what matters now that the institutions which previously made that determination can no longer be trusted to do so alone. The legitimacy crisis of institutions is not going to be resolved by better institutions in the old sense. It is going to be resolved, if it is resolved, by new forms of collective authority that derive their legitimacy not from expert asymmetry, but from the quality of their processes. From the demonstrated capacity to receive disagreement and metabolize it into direction. From the transparency of their filtering mechanisms. From the genuine inclusion of the populations that the old institutions excluded. That is a harder form of legitimacy to build. It is slower, noisier, more vulnerable to capture by confident minorities, more demanding of the people who participate in it. But it is the only form of legitimacy available to a civilization in which cognitive asymmetry is no longer a sufficient basis for authority. The institutions of industrial civilization are not failing because they were badly designed for their moment. Most of them were well designed for their moment. They are failing because their moment is ending, and the transition to the next moment has not yet produced the institutional forms adequate to it. The 1% does not claim to be those forms in their final shape. It claims to be the first space where they can be attempted, where the legitimacy crisis is not denied or managed or suppressed, but held, architecturally, spatially, governmentally, as the condition of a real experiment in what authority looks like when it can no longer rest on what it rested on before. The institutions are losing ground. The ground must be rebuilt. The 1% begins with the ground.
The Ghost in the Infrastructure, a critical review of Indistinguishable One. Overview and premise: the subbasement of the global mind. In the subterranean chill beneath Dubai's International Financial Center, DFC, Indistinguishable locates its ontological ground zero. Dubai is reified here not merely as a setting, but as an active, computational participant, a city-state operating on the bleeding edge of its own obsolescence, running 22 minutes ahead of its own optimization systems. Our entry into this labyrinth is Layla Haddad, an analyst peering into a quantum behavioral cluster that generates unsolicited, rhythmic analyses of human nodes. This premise masterfully shifts the techno-thriller's focus. We are no longer in a narrative of hacking as an act of intrusion, but rather one of inheriting an instrument without an explanation. The novel's central hook, the spontaneous coordination of human will, suggests a field effect that bypasses conventional communication entirely, manifesting in a 41-hour cycle of behavioral synchronicity that mirrors the breathing rate of the global substrate itself. The stakes. The novel posits a struggle not for territory or resources, but for the cognitive field inhabited by 3 billion people. It is a white war fought on the very ground in which human will grows, where the prize is the substrate of collective trust. It is an abode of unbounded war, where conflict is defined by its duration rather than its violence, targeting the training weights of our collective mind. The narrative's intellectual ancestry stretches back beyond the gleaming glass of the DIFC to a deep temporal layer, the 1971 Tehran Group. 7 unnamed authors, working in a borrowed house, identified this Shabaka field decades before the infrastructure existed.
Prodigy LLC, the Gene Bank.
When everything is free, your genome is the only asset left.
There was a time when men traded oil, then data, then attention. Now they trade children. Not the loud, sticky kind that spilled juice on the marble floors of Aspen. The quiet kind. The frozen kind. The kind sealed in nitrogen vaults beneath tax havens and biotech sanctuaries. In the age of post-scarcity, material hunger ended. AI optimized agriculture. Energy fell from orbit like confetti. Work dissolved into hobby. Currency collapsed into reputation. Reputation collapsed into algorithm. When everything became abundant, value had to retreat somewhere. It retreated into the cell, into the double helix, into the wet archive of possibility. Welcome to Prodigy LLC, the world's first vertically integrated genomic exchange. Part hedge fund, part fertility clinic, part sovereign microstate. All smile, no fingerprints. They don't sell babies. They sell probability. Spermjackers of the elite. Procreative variations. A guide to futurelings, baby. Read full story. Related reading.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up. Dispatch from the cognitive insurgency. The revolution wasn't fought. It was deployed. The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed. Control is obsolete.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties and what indies can do about it.
The Cognitive Commons. Reclaiming intelligence from corporate and state hegemony. In the colonial era, raw materials were exported, refined elsewhere, and sold back as finished goods. In the data era, behavioral traces are exported, refined into models, and sold back as intelligence. The illusion lies in scale. When a system serves billions, its policies appear universal. The more people rely on it, the more its outputs feel objective. Consider how alignment pipelines are built: curated datasets, reinforcement learning from selected evaluators, red teaming guided by institutional priorities. Each layer filters possibility space. Each layer reflects assumptions about risk, speech, and legitimacy. This is unavoidable. All systems encode values. The question is not whether alignment is ideological. It is whether its ideology is contestable. In a decentralized landscape, values are explicit. A model aligned to one community's norms declares its scope. Another model, tuned differently, offers an alternative. Debate shifts from lobbying a central authority to building viable options. Power fragments. Responsibility localizes. When only hyperscale providers can train competitive systems, dependency hardens. Guilds counter by aggregating resources horizontally. Universities, local businesses, independent developers, and civic institutions can contribute hardware or capital into cooperative clusters. Not to rival every frontier lab overnight, but to ensure alternatives exist. Instead of closed-door deliberations followed by press releases, proposals are submitted on-chain. Votes are tallied transparently. Funding streams are distributed according to encoded rules. Treasury allocations follow auditable logic. Legitimacy is no longer asserted. It is computed. Empires unify by absorption. They promise stability. They deliver standardization. They centralize difference until it resembles compliance. But sovereignty does not require isolation, and coordination does not require conquest.
This one's sanitized. Next. Got it. Holding for review. Good. Keep the pace up. The crisis failed. Blockades collapsed. Control is obsolete. The Straight Gambit, a chronicle of the last control protocol.
It takes a pirate to catch one.
Amazon rarely provides restitution for lost royalties and what indies can do about it.